The studio went dead silent, until Denzel leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You know what the world sees, Mr. Trump," he said, eyes locked on him. "A man who bows when the powerful walk in the room, and then turns around to crush the weak. That's not leadership. That's cowardice." The audience gasped. The words weren't shouted, they were delivered calm, sharp, undeniable. Millions watching at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing this wasn't another scripted exchange. This was a strike straight to the core. Trump shifted in his chair, his face turning red as the camera zoomed in. He forced a smirk, waving his hand dismissively. "Please, this isn't Hollywood, Denzel. This is the real world." But Denzel didn't flinch. He let the silence linger, then replied in a steady tone that cut even deeper, "Exactly. And in the real world, people are tired of leaders who kneel to power but trample the powerless. That ends tonight." The crowd erupted, half in cheers, half in shock. For the first time, Trump's trademark confidence looked cracked. Trump slammed his hand on the table, the microphone rattling as his voice rose. "You don't get it, Denzel. I've dealt with world leaders, I've built empires. I know what it takes to win. You just read lines on a screen." The audience murmured, some gasping, some laughing nervously. But Denzel didn't blink. Instead, he leaned back, calm and composed, letting Trump's outburst hang in the air like smoke. Then he struck. "You built empires?" Denzel said, his tone razor-sharp. "No, you built illusions. Castles of gold for yourself, while everyday people carried the weight. You call that winning? That's theater, Mr. Trump. And not even good theater." The crowd exploded, some clapping, others stunned into silence. Cameras caught Trump's jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing as if he'd just been cornered. For the first time that night, the man who thrived on control was losing it in front of millions. And Denzel wasn't done. He leaned forward again, his voice steady but fierce. "The difference between us is simple. I don't need a script to speak the truth. And you've been acting your whole life." The room shook with applause. Trump sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. Trump's face flushed a deeper shade of red as he pointed across the table, his finger trembling with rage. "You don't get to lecture me, Denzel. I made America respect it again. I dealt with threats that you couldn't even imagine. You live in a fantasy world, a Hollywood bubble, while I carried the weight of the nation on my back." His voice cracked on the last word, but the microphones caught every tremor. The crowd murmured, split between cheers and jeers. Trump leaned into the noise, desperate to wrestle back control. "You talk about truth? The truth is, without me, this country would be eaten alive by globalists, by enemies, by weakness. I stood strong when others hid." Denzel didn't interrupt. He waited, eyes steady, letting Trump's fury unravel into the air. Then, in a low and measured tone, he delivered his counterstrike. "Strong? No, Mr. Trump. Strength isn't bowing to those with power and punishing those without it. That's fear dressed up as dominance. Real strength is standing for people who can't stand alone. Real strength is lifting, not crushing." The studio broke into applause again, louder than before. Trump tried to speak over it, his words dissolving into noise. His face twisted in frustration as cameras zoomed in, capturing the crack in his armor. Denzel leaned closer, his voice now a whisper amplified by silence. "You didn't carry the weight of the nation. You carried the weight of your own ego. And tonight, it's collapsing right here, in front of everyone." The eruption of cheers shook the studio, drowning Trump's protests. For the first time, the crowd wasn't his to command. The man who once thrived on spectacle had become the spectacle. The tension in the studio was unbearable. Trump leaned forward, his fists pressing hard into the table, knuckles white under the bright lights. His voice, raw and ragged, cut through the room. "You sit there and act like some kind of saint, Denzel. But you've never had to make the decisions I made. You've never had to stare down leaders who wanted to destroy us. You don't know the first thing about power. You've never held it, you've only pretended to. The audience booed, some clapping in defense, others shouting back. The moderator tried to interject, but her voice was drowned beneath the storm of noise. Trump turned toward the cameras, his finger stabbing the air. I'm the only reason America is strong. Without me, we'd be weak, overrun, forgotten. People love to attack me because I won't kneel. But I'll tell you this, I never bow. And that was the moment Denzel struck again. Calm. Precise. Deadly. You never bow, he said, leaning closer, his voice steady as stone. No, Mr. Trump. You bow all the time. You bow to money. You bow to power. You bow to anyone who can give you something in return. And when it comes to the powerless, the voiceless, the vulnerable, you crush them under your heel. That's not leadership. That's betrayal. The crowd erupted. Some leapt to their feet, clapping, others stunned into silence. Trump's eyes darted, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words that wouldn't come. His famous quick retorts, his arsenal of insults, they failed him in this moment. Denzel let the applause wash over the stage before finishing. The truth isn't glamorous. It doesn't need gold letters on a tower. It needs courage. And courage is something you can't fake, not here, not tonight, not ever. The studio shook with cheers as Trump sat frozen, the spotlight exposing not his strength, but his unraveling. For a long moment, Trump didn't move. The cameras caught every flicker of his expression, the tightening jaw, the flare in his nostrils, the beads of sweat glistening beneath the studio lights. He finally leaned back, forcing a crooked grin, but it was thin, brittle, a mask slipping at the edges. You're an actor, Denzel, he sneered, his voice low but sharp. This is just another performance for you. You read lines. I built empires. Don't think you can lecture me about courage when you've lived in Hollywood fantasy. The audience hissed, some shouting back, others clapping in defiance. The moderator raised a hand for order, but the room was too far gone, the clash too electric. Trump adjusted his tie, as if regaining balance, then jabbed a finger toward Denzel. You're trying to humiliate me on national television. But let me tell you something, you don't know humiliation until you've been in the Oval Office, with the weight of the world on your shoulders. I carried that burden. You carried scripts. Denzel's eyes narrowed, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You keep saying I'm an actor, he replied calmly, but tonight, everyone here can see who's playing a role, and who's speaking from the heart. You think leadership is about the spotlight, about applause. But real leadership is measured when no one is watching. And the truth? You bowed to those with power and silenced those without. That's not leadership. That's theater, and you've been playing America's most dangerous role. The crowd exploded. Some stood, roaring in approval, while others jeered, red-faced with anger. Phones shot up, recording every second. Hashtags began trending before the segment had even ended. Trump slammed his palm against the table, rattling the microphones. This is a setup. A disgrace. You're finished, Washington, he shouted, his voice cracking beneath the strain. But Denzel, unshaken, leaned forward just enough for his words to pierce through the chaos. No, Mr. Trump. Tonight, the performance ended. The mask is off, and the country is watching. The eruption of noise was seismic, a mixture of cheers, boos, and the undeniable buzz of history in the making. The studio was chaos, but outside those walls, the ripple had already begun. News outlets were cutting into regular programming with breaking news banners. Social media feeds flooded with clips of Trump pounding the table, his voice breaking, while Denzel sat calm and unshaken, like an immovable stone. The contrast was too sharp, too cinematic to ignore. Inside, the moderator finally called for a commercial break, her voice trembling. We need order, please, we'll be back in 60 seconds. The cameras faded, but the audience did not calm. Half the room buzzed like an energized hive, others argued openly, shouting across aisles. It felt less like a studio and more like a nation condensed into a single space, divided, boiling, alive. Trump leaned toward his advisors offstage, his face red with fury. "Get me control of this," he barked. "This is a disaster." He dabbed his forehead with a tissue, muttering, "They'll twist this, they'll make it look like he owned me." Denzel, meanwhile, had leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, breathing slow, as though conserving energy for the storm still to come. An aide whispered to him, "You broke through. People are standing outside with signs. They're chanting your name." He opened his eyes, calm but resolute. "It's not about my name," he said quietly. "It's about the truth getting a moment of oxygen in a room that's been suffocating for years." When the cameras snapped back on, the room erupted once more. Trump forced a smile, teeth bared, but his eyes betrayed the panic. He spoke first, his voice clipped. "Folks, don't be fooled. This man wants to divide us. He wants to undermine everything we've built." But before he could finish, Denzel leaned into his mic, his voice sharp, clean, and unflinching. "No, Mr. Trump. Division doesn't come from telling the truth. Division comes from pretending the truth doesn't exist." The crowd roared so loud that the microphones peaked. Online, the clip was already surging toward millions of views. For the first time all night, it was Trump, not Denzel, who looked like the actor caught under a spotlight too hot to bear. By the time the broadcast ended, Washington was already on fire. Cable networks replayed the clash on a loop, Trump's fists hammering the desk, Denzel's steady gaze cutting through the noise. Hashtag spread like wildfire, hashtag truth over power, hashtag Denzel versus Trump, hashtag no more excuses. In Capitol Hill hallways, lawmakers huddled in whispers. Some Republicans shook their heads, muttering that Trump had finally crossed a line too visible to ignore. Others doubled down, rushing to cable shows to call Denzel arrogant, Hollywood, or worse. Yet even those attacks carried an edge of desperation, as if the defenders knew the ground was shifting beneath them. Across the globe, foreign media framed the night as something bigger than an argument. It was a referendum. BBC ran with, "American actor schools former president on live TV." Al Jazeera called it, "a moment of moral clarity." In Germany, the papers compared Denzel to a statesman, not an entertainer. Suddenly, the world was asking if America's loudest politician had just been humbled by a man who wasn't even running for office. Trump, pacing in his private quarters, refused to let it go. "They're spinning it," he shouted at his aides. "I wasn't rattled, I was passionate. Write that down. Passionate." But no matter how he tried to frame it, the images told another story, his face twisted in rage, his opponent unshaken. Meanwhile, Denzel left the studio quietly, slipping into a black SUV. Reporters swarmed, microphones stretched forward, shouting, "Did you just end Trump's influence?" He didn't stop. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I told the truth. What people do with it, that's their choice." By morning, the clip had shattered records, 17 million views overnight, trending across platforms. What began as a televised debate had become something else entirely, a cultural earthquake shaking power at its foundation. Trump's inner circle was in turmoil. Advisors barked at each other in late-night conference calls, blaming producers, moderators, even the lighting crew. One aide slammed his fist on the table, "We told him not to take the bait." But he couldn't help himself. Another muttered, "It's not the clip, it's the contrast." Rage versus calm. Guess which one America remembers? Behind closed doors at Mar-a-Lago, Trump replayed the footage over and over. Each time, his jaw clenched tighter. "He's an actor," Trump spat, pointing at the screen. This was scripted. He rehearsed that line. But the anger in his voice betrayed something deeper, fear. For once, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. Meanwhile, Denzel moved differently. He rejected dozens of interview requests, declined flashy morning shows, and ignored the bait of cable news panelists desperate to drag him back into the mud. Instead, he met quietly with community leaders in Los Angeles, joined a Zoom call with student activists, and delivered a single, understated message: truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to stand. The restraint only amplified his impact. Political commentators marveled at his discipline. By saying less, he's saying more, one strategist told CNN. On Twitter, a viral post summed it up. Trump screamed. Denzel whispered, "Guess who won?" Even some conservatives admitted, off the record, that the optics were brutal. If he can't stay calm against an actor, one GOP insider said, how's he going to stand up to foreign leaders? In the days that followed, fundraising emails from Trump's camp painted him as a victim of Hollywood elitism. But donations were down, while clips of Denzel's steady words continued to climb. What should have been just another media scuffle had turned into something larger, a crack in the armor of Trump's untouchability. And the crack was widening. Across America, the clash between Trump and Denzel seeped into everyday life. In New York, Times Square's massive screens replayed the viral clip on news tickers, and people stopped mid-stride to watch, phones up, recording reactions. A construction worker in a hard hat shook his head and said, "Man, he finally got checked." In Atlanta, a teacher streamed the debate in her civics class, telling students, "This is what it looks like when calm dismantles chaos." On TikTok, teens remixed Denzel's words into music, layering beats under his line, "Division doesn't come from truth. Division comes from denying it." Millions watched, commented, and stitched their own stories of being silenced or ignored, suddenly finding language for their frustration. In Chicago, a mural appeared overnight, spray paint on a brick wall showing Denzel sitting calm while Trump raged, flames rising behind him. The caption read simply, "Strength is silence." Within hours, it was trending online as locals posted selfies with the artwork. Meanwhile, barbershops, diners, and coffee shops buzzed. Trump supporters insisted he'd been ambushed, claiming the media spun the clip unfairly. But even some lifelong loyalists admitted privately that the optics were brutal. One retired Marine in Texas told a reporter, "I voted for Trump twice, but what I saw last night looked weak. Presidents don't lose their cool like that." Denzel's team, however, refused to celebrate. His aide reminded him, "This isn't over. They'll try to paint you as arrogant, un-American, whatever they can." Denzel nodded, answering with the same calm that had electrified millions, "Let them. My job is not to match their noise. My job is to remind people that truth has a voice too." By week's end, opinion polls shifted slightly. Not a landslide, but a crack. And in politics, sometimes a crack is how the flood begins. A week later, the frenzy had slowed, but the echo of that night refused to fade. News cycles shifted to other scandals, but clips of Denzel versus Trump still surfaced daily, on podcasts, in classrooms, even in sermons. It had become more than a moment, it was a reference point. In Washington, insiders whispered about fractures inside Trump's camp. Some donors grumbled about optics, while others quietly withheld checks. Meanwhile, journalists noted that Denzel's words, "Division doesn't come from truth. Division comes from denying it," were being quoted in speeches from city councils to protest rallies. One evening, Denzel sat in a modest community center in South Los Angeles. The room wasn't filled with cameras, just locals, teachers, single parents, teenagers in hoodies. They asked him what came next, if he'd run for office, if he'd take this viral wave and turn it into power. He smiled, shook his head. "I'm not here to run," he said softly. "I'm here to remind people that power doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the clearest one." At that exact moment, across the country, Trump stood at a rally, shouting into a microphone. He dismissed the debate as fake news theater, accused Denzel of being propped up by Hollywood elites. The crowd cheered, but even in the roar, something felt thinner. Reporters noted fewer signs, fewer chants. Energy was slipping. Back in LA, a teenager raised her hand. "How do we know when to speak up?" she asked. Denzel leaned forward, his voice steady. "When the silence feels heavier than the risk." The room fell quiet, not with fear, but with understanding. And that was the difference. Trump left people shouting. Denzel left them thinking. History would decide which carried further, but in that moment, the lesson was already clear. Calm could cut sharper than rage, and truth, spoken plainly, could shake the ground beneath the powerful. Moments like this remind us of something bigger than politics. They remind us that strength isn't about who yells the loudest or who commands the biggest stage. Strength is about clarity, dignity, and refusing to shrink when the world demands silence. Whether you agree with Denzel or not, his words hit because they carried truth without fear. And that truth, that calm in the middle of chaos, cannot be ignored. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder: power isn't noise, power is presence.